I'm going to be talking about design fundamentals, which will cover things like layout, visual hierarchy, and simplification. Layout refers to how text and images are organized in a given space, for example, a web page, a cell sheet, a poster, or anything like that. And visual hierarchy is the principle of arranging elements in a layout to show their importance. Together, layout and visual hierarchy are the two most basic fundamentals used in every design. Lastly, simplification, as related to design, refers to removing any unnecessary elements. 9 times out of 10, there are more content than needed to convey a message successfully in a given design. So we'll talk about how to do that. The first fundamental I want to talk about is layout. This includes using a grid, alignment, how to space things out, and contrast. Looking at the image to the right, there's a layout with shapes scattered about that represent blocks of type. Their placement has no rhyme or reason and is very unorganized. In order to start cleaning this up, we want to add an underlying grid that will create structure and consistency in the layout. Forming a grid is very simple. Many programs like Adobe InDesign, Adobe Illustrator, or even PowerPoint have built-in tools to easily create a useful grid. The goal here is to define a grid with enough columns and rows so that you have flexibility to accommodate various content and layouts. In the image on the right, I added a 4-column vertical grid that includes a margin surrounding the main area of the page. I also added a horizontal grid to help in later steps on adjusting spacing and contrast. Once you have a grid established, you can easily get things in order. Alignment is important to create structure in your design and keep things organized for easy reading. In the example, I align blocks on the left. This is a good place to start and is usually the most simple type of layout. It creates a nice focal point for the reader to scan and follow along with down the page. Multi-column layouts also work well if you have small chunks of content you want to organize side by side, but for our purposes, we'll stick with the simple left-align layout. Next, we want to further organize the information by adjusting the space between the elements. Spacing informs the grouping of similar content on a page. Using appropriate spacing makes information easier to read. It's preferred to use consistent increments while spacing out content, whether it's to conform to the grid we created or by separating things out with equal systematic units like pixels, inches, centimeters, etc. In the example to the right, groupings are created by separating the blocks by equal amounts of space, and then by aligning those blocks to the horizontal grid. You can see that with the red lines. The last thing I want to talk about in this section, and easily one of the most important, is contrast. The quickest and simplest way to improve the contrast of a layout is by having the size of the elements on the page change drastically. In the example, I created a nice distinction between the top boxes and the bottom, giving them a good contrast in size. Another way to improve contrast in a design is by adjusting the colors and amounts of each color being used. Using shades of a single color for a design, also called monochromatic, sets yourself up for minimal contrast. Ideally, you will have at least 2 colors, a neutral color for things like text and an accent color for things like calls to action that you want to draw people's attention with. But just be careful because sometimes colors don't play well together. In the example, I made the top boxes darker than the others, creating a contrast in value, bringing interest to the larger, more important information. When your design has good contrast, it will have a clear focal point and guide the reader's eye in the direction you want. Contrast should be considered throughout the entire design process, but it's definitely something I like to think to myself before finalizing a graphic. So as you can see, in just a few simple steps and some consideration of grid, alignment, spacing, and contrast, you can take a mess of information and refine it into an organized, easy to follow layout. We've touched on a few things that build visual hierarchy, but now I want to dig in a little deeper, specifically into type and color. Using these elements in harmony with correct visual hierarchy leads to a more successful design. Now, I can talk about type all day, but I won't nerd out on you too much for your sakes. I'll just go over a few of the bigger picture tips for this. First being, when selecting type, you need to consider if you already have a brand standard and use that if possible. If you don't, then try to find something similar. This might be something you run into when you're using platforms like PowerPoint or Google Slides, since they don't always have every typeface. If you're working on a new project that requires a typeface, it's helpful to select one that supports the theme and message. For example, you probably wouldn't use a fun typeface for a very serious message, or vice versa. And lastly, a note that harkens back to keeping things simple. It's always best to try and limit your design to use only one or two different typefaces. When it comes to type alignment, left align is generally your best choice. There are times when center alignment makes sense, like I know we've used that on web pages we've designed and things like that. But if the content gets too wordy, this can become very hard to read. So we tend to use that for only really short blurbs of type. The right align copy should be reserved for things like notes or small callouts on the page. This is helpful to use maybe when you're designing a poster, when there's a little blurb of text that feels nicely aligned on the right-hand side. And lastly, it's helpful to try and limit line length to about 50 to 60 characters. With lines longer than that, it causes strain on the reader's eyes and makes it more difficult to track one line to the next. When organizing information with type, it helps to group small bits of similar content together. Do this by creating a headline accompanied by a few sentences or bullets below. Even though you may think people read everything word for word on a page, studies show that they do not do this. Grouping content gives the reader the ability to scan and find the relevant information in a timely manner. Adding contrast to a block of type works wonders. Looking at the image to the right, the top example uses the same text weight, style, and color, making it lack the visual rhythm that is required for scanning, and will likely cause the reader to skip over useful information that you want them to see. Signaling important points using bold accents and adding different color calls to action will make your content more accessible and easier to the reader. Keep in mind, if you bolden too many things or add too many colors, things can get messy quick. So as always, keep it simple. So we've mentioned color a few times before, but let's go over a couple more tips about using it. Similar to type, you may already have assigned brand colors, so be sure to use those since they are a big factor in brand recognition. When using your brand colors, it does help to have a secondary palette as a complement for things like sub-brands, calls to actions, and other elements of your designs. Looking at the image to the right, there are three separate palettes. We use the top one for inductive automation branding, the middle for ignition, and the bottom for ignition edge. They all work together, but when used separately, it's really easy to tell what product is being promoted just by the colors themselves. So I know I've said this numerous times today, but keep in mind contrast. In the example on the right, there's green type on an orange background. This has very little contrast, and the colors create a horrible effect when looking at them, making the words almost impossible to read, or at least makes me not want to read them at all. Below, the green type on the darker background has greater contrast, making it easier on the eyes. Keep this in mind when selecting colors for foreground and background elements, especially text. One trick I do a lot when designing is called the squint test. What you do is you squint your eyes. If you are still able to make out the main content of a design, whether it's the type or the image or any other element that's supposed to be in focus, the contrast is good. If not, then you have some adjusting to do. The last point I'd like to make in the design fundamentals section is simply simplify. Simplifying your design and simplifying your message should be the two goals with any piece of content, written or visual. Anything extra impeding the viewer's ability to read a message quickly and successfully should be rethought or removed entirely. You're trying to make an impression, and it's hard to do that when there are too many elements on a page and nothing to focus on. When you see a design that just feels right, usually after breaking it down, it's because someone has spent time working through these fundamentals to best portray this content in a meaningful, memorable way.